So there's a lot of conversations going on today about academia and the notion that, should you go into it? And there's a lot of people who are leaving academia and talking about it. And there's that so much that there's actually a term for it. It's called quit lit. So I got my contribution here to the, it's not literature, it's not written, but it's a video talking about my experience, why I left academia. So just to give some kind of overview, I was a research scientist, and so that's just kind of just beyond a postdoc, but I was in this sort of phase and position for like 7 years, never became an assistant professor, but basically the position was that I was like a postdoc, but I had the ability to write grants and get major grants that assistant professors would write. So here we go. Reasons why I left academia. Number one, I just want to point out that anytime you're in a field that has a large number of competitors compared to the number of job openings, if there's way more people looking for the job than there are job openings, you can't anticipate that you will be treated well. And this is not supposed to be specific to academia, but just a general message about life in general, is that there's no way that they can really fully appreciate you if they know that you're easily replaceable. And we are in a situation where there's tons of educated people, tons of PhDs and college graduates who are trying to fill up these roles that there simply are not enough roles for them. So your thoughts, your ideas, the scrutiny in which you will be evaluated is much higher than it ever would be, because they can ask, are you checking off all the major check boxes? Do you have a previous grant? Do you have a paper in a big journal? Do you have a bunch of papers? Can you collaborate with people? Are you known for something? Do you have a reputation for some of your findings? These are all things that institutions can try to require of you, because if you don't satisfy those, they can kind of keep looking and try to find somebody who better satisfies that. Number two, academia is sluggish to follow changes in society. And it's kind of amazing. In general, the area of politics is sluggish and bureaucratic systems are very sluggish. Academia is. And if you compare that to business is actually incentivized to be innovative and create change. Academia is incentivized not to change, because people who have established themselves and have sort of in the higher areas of the hierarchy in the institution are incentivized to keep the same way that they get evaluated in place. So if we've always been evaluating people by the number of publications or their ability to bring in grant money, then the people who are successful based on that criteria want that criteria to stay in place. They want their journals to be preserved, the journal system to be preserved, and the way things are done to be preserved. If new metrics of success become introduced, like let's say that reproducibility is one of the key criteria. So we don't care that you publish a bunch of papers, but are your papers reproducible? Or did you publicly make your data available? Or did you collaborate with a bunch of people? If a different form of values starts to get inserted in how they get judged, then there will be some resistance to that. And basically, we have the ability now. I think that the biggest adaptation that we have is social media, and the fact that you can get out there and communicate what you think to everybody basically immediately. And so the notion of these artificial delays in, I have a finding, I have to structure that finding in a very specific way based on the norms and the rules, and I have to go through a long peer review process with 3 random reviewers and submit it to a journal, which is behind a paywall that all these institutions have to pay money to gain access to actually read the articles, which is funded by taxpayer money. There's a lot that they potentially have on the line, but we can publish papers now without this same system. And people can have conversations and evaluate each other and discuss ideas without this structured system. And actually, that is what is in part happening, and that is going to accelerate changes in academia. So, the more important your findings are, the less we want to depend on that structure. In the context of the COVID crisis that we're dealing with, if you have a discovery that is impactful in terms of like your knowledge of the way that the virus affects the body and how it can be treated and so on, we want that information out there as quick as possible. And that whole system should be disregarded. And many people have sort of shifted to that perspective. Like I've heard a few stories of people who had publications that were waiting to go through that system, and they're just like, I don't want to wait through this system anymore. I'm just going to put it out there. And you could do that. So the notion that when it's actually important that you have to come out there and you just want it to be out there to actually contribute to society sort of recognizes how unimportant, or how based on sort of vanity metrics and appearance, the journal format system is, where we think about how much impact is that journal, how exclusive is it to get published in there, and so on. The real impact obviously is the impact that that paper has on the communication and the ideas that other people have, and the impact on society, which is different from the journal. So that's a system, and people are talking about that. And Twitter actually leaned me in this direction of realizing the issues with academia, because on Twitter you have a bunch of people and PhDs working in the universities who are basically airing all their grievances, talking about all the issues. And so you're constantly confronted with issues of how how a lot of studies are not reproducible, and you're confronted with statistical issues of the arbitrariness of the p-value threshold at 0.05, and how frustrating the whole process is of dealing with academia. And it's actually difficult to be in the system, but to mainly be exposed to others in the system who spend most of their time highlighting the issues of that system. It's not very motivating. I would love to be, on social media with my peers and be talking about very interesting things about my research and interesting topics like that. So another thing is I had this realization that the issues that within your particular field, the issues that are prominent and talked about today might still be talked about decades from now. And so I just had this image of myself being some old guy at a conference, going up talking to some grad student and realizing that they were trying to answer some question that had actually been answered decades before by a lot of different people sort of in different ways, but they're just not aware of it because it's hard to be aware of all that literature. So you have a lot of experience and you are aware of it, but young people might not be aware that they're solving a problem that might have been solved in some way before, and partly because it's not necessarily about that. It's just about the tackling and understanding and getting that skill set involved. And they're going to gravitate towards something that's a bit easier. So in certain fields, you have these phenomenon that are just very simply easy to measure. Like in my field of measuring brain responses with EEG, if you put an electrode on the back of the scalp, and close your eyes, you'll see these very strong fluctuations, and then you open your eyes and then they get smaller. And generally these are related to individuals' alertness. If your eyes are open the entire time, it's also related to your alertness level. And so because it's easy to measure, people gravitate to it and they want to focus on it. And they almost become more interested in what the phenomenon represents itself than the insights that can be gleaned from that phenomenon. So it's like this fascination with that particular thing that can be measured that sort of goes off in its own direction and loses sight of why it's important in the first place. There's a stereotypical response in the EEG that comes on when something unexpected happens. And that's another example, is that it's called the P300. And these researchers became so focused on let's clarify and understand what the P300 is exactly as its own distinct thing, instead of like, what does this actually mean about human psychology? How can we use this to reveal insights about how we process information, as opposed to this phenomenon is uniquely distinct and important. And so I become sort of obsessed with trying to understand what it is in isolation of that sort of bigger picture. And one example I have of that is I went to a neuroimaging training program 2013 at UCLA for 2 weeks. We all, listened to people talk, and we were all tasked with recording fMRI responses. So in the magnet, you get pictures of the brain and brain activity driven by blood flow changes. And every group of people had to come up with an experiment that they were going to collect in the MRI machine. And every single group looked at what is called the resting state network, or the default mode network. And basically what that indicates is, and this is a whole thing that become very popular in that field, is, the default mode, let's study the default mode. And again, this is driven more by the fact that it's easy to measure than by the fact that it's actually interesting. And the fact that all of these students independently in only a 2-week time went in and were able to measure this thing shows how easy it is to measure. And so when we're giving our presentations, we're all talking about the default mode network, not because it's interesting, but because it's easy to measure. And so the field of fMRI got very excited and interested in this network. And I had the realization that I could be in a conference decades from now, again, and people will be focused on this default mode network and heavily interested in it, not because it's actually interested in it, not because it's actually interesting, but because it's easy to measure, and many people have access to collect it, and especially early grad students, and then here they are talking about it. So I think I was numbering these things at some point. I forgot what number I'm on right now. So next one. Academia, I had the realization that academia is not the best way to influence people and to influence society. And I think it was pretty naive that it's throughout a lot of, my time in school, I believed that publishing scientific papers and making scientific findings was the way to achieve progress as a society. But the main areas of progress are actually driven by companies and industries taking chances. So in many cases, the innovations in technology that we see are found by groups that are just experimenting and just trying out different things and trying to solve some problem for society. And only after the fact do they come in and understand the science of why it works. The next insight I had that pushed me off away from academia was that I realized that I could potentially, if my goal is to understand human behavior, I could potentially have a greater understanding of human behavior by getting out into the world and interacting with humans when their real world decisions are on the line. Academic situation, when you study people, you're studying them in a constrained, arbitrary context. So maybe students decided that some money that they imagined in their head should go towards one thing, A over B, but in the real world, it's real world money that may go to A over B, but it's the real world situation on the line. And so knowing how to deal with people and interact with people in that context, arguably, I would argue that the people who are in that situation understand more about human behavior than academics do. If all you're doing is writing academic papers about human behavior, sure, you know a lot, but you know it in a very constrained, confined context where you have a prescribed way of doing things. So the irony is that the way that we're motivated in real life is based on different factors than we're motivated in the academic setting, because it's a rigid structure. So, communicating your findings in a very prescribed way, using a very specific form of language, there's an arbitrariness to that. In fact, there's an arbitrariness to kind of a lot of the heuristics that they use to make decisions. I know they require you to take a GRE test to get into grad school, and that involves knowing a lot of words that you kind of have to be privileged to know. Like, I did read a lot of books growing up, but I didn't read, I guess, the right books to learn the right words. So I was very poor at the GRE, and it's very frustrating when your intelligence is supposed to be dictated by knowing these kind of fancy words that are in these historic novels that you were supposed to have read, but number of papers that you published, these sort of arbitrary factors that are separate from the real world interaction that you have with people. So this is my little rant on why I left academia. It's just part one. I got some more rants in me about this, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button, and you can hit the subscribe and the bell to stay tuned on my post. Typically I'm talking about music and my experience in music, and it was actually that experience that helped push me out of academia, and I'll talk about that later. So thanks for checking this out.